It really is such a pleasure to be here. I'm drawing energy from Eric Foner. I'm drawing energy from my old friend Jelani. I'm drawing energy from past Hillman winners. Because when I cut on the TV today, there was a lot of, how could this happen? Can't believe this. Saw senators claiming that justices had lied. A lot of indignation and shock. But there's some of us who were never shocked. And I just want to, just start actually by giving a shout out to two past Hillman winners. I don't think they're here, but I wish they were. But that's Dahlia Lithwick and Rebecca Traister. And I raise them because I actually think they're in conversation with the two books I'm going to talk about this evening. We live in a time, and maybe it's always been this way, but we live in a time of spiritualism, of belief in the ghost and the American machine, and that is to say that the ancestral magic of our founders, the genius of our institutions, the great theory of our founding documents are not simply enough to ensure the survival of our country, but are the greatest ever conceived in the world. And we stand here on a day and we find that that genius cannot protect the basic rights, the bodies of half its citizenry, where the labor, and I emphasize labor, of child rearing and childbearing shall essentially be made mandatory. And there's a lot of shock about how this could happen, as I said earlier. And I think part of the understanding of how it could happen and why is contained in the two books that we have here, which trace the long history of forced labor and the present status of essential labor in the country right now. Clint Smith, my good friend Clint Smith, my brother. Clint Smith's book, How the Word Was Passed, takes us on a journey from Goree Island to Monticello, from Wall Street's foundation built by forced labor, to Angola prison where forced labor continues to this very day, literally built on a slave plantation. The best thing I can say about Clint's book, and I've told Clint this, and you're gonna have to give me a chance to explain this, is that this book has no right to be as great as it actually is. Its ambition is a kind of American travelogue retracing the footsteps of enslavement. And that ambition is striking. I have seen a lot of writers either try to or claim that they were going to try to do what Clint does. When you're in my field, it's common to meet young writers who say that they have a collection of essays or they're gonna essay about this or essay about that. But what very few of them have, what very few of us have, is Clint's sheer skill. How the Word Was Passed ranges from memoir to reportage to history with ease. But Clint is, at his heart, a poet, and what seals the book, what brings all of these desperate genres and forms together is his sheer lyricism. The year my grandmother was born, the Florida Panhandle was burning hot with white terror. Black children were taught to keep their eyes down, their mouths shut, and to make it home before the sun dissolved behind the trees. The year my grandmother was born, the country was on the cusp of entering a war being fought across two oceans. Black men would be sent to fight for freedom and come back to a land where they did not have their own. The year my grandmother was born, she was held in her mother's arms and had no way of knowing how soon that embrace would disappear and never return. How soon her mother's face would become something she couldn't remember. The year my grandmother was born, there were laws that wrapped themselves around the necks of everyone she knew, and no one knew if they would let go. That's Clint, that's not me. Can't write like that. Now, people will say that that's just pretty writing, that's just beautiful writing. But what Clint's writing really is clarifying, because beauty is clarifying. When I think of beautiful writing, I think of stripping away all of the adornment and reducing something down to its essence. And that's exactly what How the Word Was Passed does for American history. Clint takes what is abstract and he makes it personal, real, and touchable. What Clint does for history and for that genre of labor that built this country, my other brother and good friend, Eyal Press, does for the kind of labor that upholds us to this very day. Dirty work, which is such a just an ingenious term. Dirty work, which is labor that society both delegates and at the same time disdains. Like how the word is passed, the sweep of Eyal's book is epic. We visit drone operators who are waging war within walking distance of churches and are deprived of the honor generally awarded to the armed forces. We are on the slaughter floor with animals who are tortured by immigrants who carry the moral stain of their work, even though that stain is awarded by those who employ them and regularly consume their yield. Gotta have our cheap hamburgers. We are with brutal prison guards who mete out punishment and then are disdained as fake police. Like how the word is passed, Eyal's book succeeds through the majesty and skill of our narrator. This is straight up, unmitigated reporting at its finest. Eyal is not content to sit at home and essay upon society from his New York apartment. He visits, he sits with, he engages with those whose labor we depend on and disdain. Now, it has to be mentioned that both of these writers are deeply personally invested in their story. And I'll just go off script for a moment, and I'll just say, you can tell I'm not the most unbiased presenter here. But I have been in a conversation with Eyal about what it means to be the descendant, the heir, the bearer of a great crime for almost 20 years now. And I've been able to bear witness as his catalog has deepened and deepened across each book, starting with, as it happens, the topic du jour, and that is the issue of abortion. It has been gratifying, it has been enlightening, and I really feel like it's reached its apex at this point in his incredible book. Clint is a little younger than both of us, but he's also starting at a place that we could have only dreamed of. And so as I've watched Clint blossom from a poet to an essayist to, against his own wishes, a reporter, it has been incredible to behold what he's offered. And I'm just so thankful, and I'm so looking forward to see where he goes from here. Thank you guys so much. We'll do this one at a time, I believe. We'll have Clint come up first, and then Eyal.
When you have a virtual book tour for basically a year, it really is different to be in the room with actual humans, even though I really believe that we should go back to being in slippers and sweatpants. And I hope for the next awards ceremony, there's a slippers and sweatpants option. I really want to thank my editor, Vanessa Mobley, who's been an incredible steward of this book, my agent, Aliyah Habib, who believed in me and pushed me and is the greatest advocate of my work that I could ever hope for. Lena Little and the whole team at Little Brown who made this book happen. I mean, there's so many people who make a book happen, from the copy editor to the production, to the publicity, to all the people who don't always get the recognition they deserve. And it really is a team effort. I want to thank my wife, who read the first draft of this book, who read the last draft of this book, who helps me become the best version of myself in every way. She's not here tonight because we have two little ones. And we tried to bring up, I was at the PEN Awards, fortunately a few weeks ago, and we tried to bring them up for that. And it was exciting for them because they got room service. But it was a less thrilling experience for us. So I decided to do this one solo. In 2017, I watched several Confederate statues come down in my hometown in New Orleans, statues of P.G.D. Beauregard, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee. And as I was watching these statues come down, I was thinking about what it meant that I grew up in a majority black city in which there were more homages to enslavers than there were to enslaved people. And I thought about what the implications of that were. What does it mean that to get to school, I had to go down Robert E. Lee Boulevard? To get to the grocery store, I had to go down Jefferson Davis Parkway. That my middle school was named after a leader of the Confederacy. That my parents still live on a street today named after someone who owned over 150 enslaved people. Because the thing is, we know that symbols and names and iconography aren't just symbols. They're reflective of the stories that people tell. And those stories shape the narratives that communities carry. And those narratives shape public policy, and public policy shapes the material conditions of people's lives. And that's not to say that taking down a 60-foot-tall statue of Robert E. Lee is going to suddenly erase the racial wealth gap, but it does help us recognize the sort of ecosystem of ideas, an ecosystem of stories and narratives that help give us an understanding of the context of American history and help us understand the way that certain communities have been disproportionately targeted and harmed throughout American history. And so I was thinking about this, and I was watching these statues come down, and I was thinking about how one of my old professors, Walter Johnson, talked about, he wrote this incredible book about the history of slavery in New Orleans and the slave trade in New Orleans, Soul by Soul. And in it he says, of New Orleans, the whole city is a memorial to slavery. It's in the roads enslaved people paved, it's in the buildings enslaved people constructed, it's in the levees enslaved people made, it's in the soil enslaved people are buried in. And I thought about how for so much of my life and my own education, I never learned about the history of slavery in any way that was commensurate with the impact and legacy that it left on my city, on my state, and on my country. And I was thinking about what it meant to grow up not having that information and not knowing and being inundated with all these messages, some explicit, some implicit, about all the things that were wrong with Black people, all the things that Black people were doing wrong, and not having the language or the toolkit or the history or the sociology with which to push back against it. And thankfully, there are so many people in this room who help give me that language, who help give me that understanding, who help give me that sense of history. And I can't express the extent to which, as I learned that information, as I learned that history, both in the process of working on this book and before, how emancipatory it was, how freeing it was, how it sort of broke me open from this social and intellectual paralysis that I felt. Because I knew that what I was hearing was wrong, but I didn't know how to say it. And I think all the time about this James Baldwin essay, 1964. It's not one of his more famous ones, but a talk to teachers. And in it, he says that the role of the teacher is to help the Black child understand that even though the world tells them over and over and over again that they are criminal, that it is in fact the society that created the conditions that this child is forced to grow up in that is the real criminal. And it seems very simple and intuitive to so many of us, but it was so transformative for me to get an understanding of that and to gain the toolkit and the history to better understand that. And part of what I wanted this book to be, you know, people often ask about who the audience for this book is or who the intended audience for this book is. It's really a 16-year-old version of me. I tried to write the sort of book that I would have wanted to read in my 10th grade American history class, the kind of book that would have helped me understand why my city, my state, and my country looked the way that it did. And I stand here too, and I'm thinking about my grandparents. And for those who read the book, the epilogue is about a visit to the National Museum of African American History and Culture I go on with my grandparents. My grandfather born in 1930, Jim Crow, Mississippi, and my grandmother born in 1939, Jim Crow, Florida. And I'm pushing my grandfather in his wheelchair, and my grandmother's walking a few paces ahead of us, and I'm looking around this museum, and I'm realizing that so much of the history and so much of the violence that is documented in this museum are things that they experienced firsthand. And when I asked my grandmother about it afterwards, she had this refrain. She was like, I lived it. I lived it. I lived it. And I'm thinking about the woman who opened the National Museum of African American History and Culture, a woman named Ruth Bonner, who rang the bell to open the museum alongside the Obama family in 2016. And she was the daughter of an enslaved person. Not the granddaughter, not the great-granddaughter. The woman who opened this museum in 2016 was the daughter of someone born into slavery. My grandfather's grandfather was enslaved. So I think about my 4-year-old son sitting on my grandfather's lap, and I imagine my grandfather sitting on his grandfather's lap. And I'm reminded that this history we tell ourselves was a long time ago, just wasn't that long ago at all, as Jelani pointed out when he was talking about Dr. Foner's work. And for me, this book is, I go to plantations, prisons, monuments, memorials, and part of what it's attempting to do is give us a sense of our collective physical proximity to this history, right? How the scars of slavery are etched into the landscape all around us. But in doing so, I think part of what was revealed to me was our collective temporal proximity to this history, that this thing was really just yesterday, right? Slavery in this country, existed in the British colonies, would become the United States, and in the United States for 250 years, and has only not existed for a little over 150. So you have an institution that existed for a century longer than it hasn't. An institution in which there are people alive today who knew, who loved, who were raised by, people who were born into bondage. So this idea that this history has nothing to do with the contemporary landscape of inequality, this idea that this history is irrelevant, to what our social, economic, and political infrastructure looks like is revealed to be morally and intellectually disingenuous. And so for me, what I hope this book does more than anything is just help people recognize how recent this was and how close it is to the world we live in today. And I also, given that this is a labor award, I want to thank this book is in many ways an homage to the public historians, to the docents, to the tour guides, the people who don't always have degrees from fancy institutions, the people who don't always, write books or win book awards or anything, but they're the people, when you show up to that museum, when you show up to that plantation, when you go on that walking tour, they carry so much knowledge. They carry so much institutional knowledge, so much of a sense of the historiography, so much a sense of what it means to talk to people about difficult topics, what it means to talk to people about this history in a way that will allow them to listen. And they always do what I call this sort of both-andedness of their approach. They extend grace and generosity while also demanding responsibility and accountability. And they do it so well. And I think, given that this is a labor award, I think really making sure that we honor the labor of them and the work that they do that doesn't always get the attention it deserves is really important. So thank you all so much. It's an incredible honor. It means the world.
Thank you so much, Ta-Nehisi, for that incredible introduction. I'm humbled and honored by your words, and I'm humbled and honored by this award. I want to thank the Hillman Foundation. I want to thank a couple of editors, because writing a book is a long process and there are many drafts. No one was more important in that process than Eric Chinsky, an amazing editor, an amazing person at Farrar, Straus and Giroux, who saw promise in this idea of a book about dirty work, a term I'll explain very shortly. I want to thank Daniel Zaleski at The New Yorker and Sasha Weiss at the New York Times Magazine, both of whom published versions of material that ended up going into the book. I want to thank the foundations and nonprofits that supported my work and supported me as I was researching and writing this book. One of them, I think, is here today, the director of the Type Media Center, Tea Grobo, which offers writers support over multi-years, which for someone working on a book is incredibly vital and important and rare. And finally, I want to thank my wife, Marae, who is here tonight, despite our having 2 kids at home. We wisely did not bring. She is the first reader of most of what I write, and also the last reader, and invariably the most exacting reader. And for that, I'm grateful, even though I don't always seem to be grateful when the feedback is coming to me. On one other personal note, I am the grandson of a labor leader and lifelong champion of worker rights and unions. My paternal grandfather, Benjamin, was a baker in Palestine in the 1920s. The workers there chose him to represent them in negotiations with management. He once told me their first demand was that no one be asked to work more than 80 hours a week. And I think they won that, and he went on from that experience to be a labor representative, and into his 80s would go to hearings representing workers who he'd felt needed support in arbitration proceedings and so forth. So he'd be very happy to hear that an award named after the great Sidney Hillman came to his grandson. Thank you. So dirty work is a well-known colloquial expression referring to kind of an odious task that maybe is physically dirtying, but that's not what I mean by dirty work in this book. Dirty work, as I describe it, is morally troubling activity that society depends on and tacitly condones, but doesn't want to hear too much about. And I draw that idea from some sociologists, in particular Everett Hughes, sociologist who taught at the University of Chicago and wrote a wonderful essay called Good People and Dirty Work. It was actually about Nazi Germany, but it applies very much to the United States. So what kind of dirty work takes place in our society that fits that definition? Well, the dirty work of caging and confining more than 2 million of our fellow citizens in jails and prisons in a penal system that stands out as much for its brutality as for its size, and a brutality that dehumanizes not only those who are incarcerated, but also those who do the work of incarcerating them. The dirty work of carrying out targeted assassinations in our never-ending wars, again, carried out in our name with widespread public support or indifference, and perpetuated now for more than 2 decades. The dirty work of manning the kill floors in industrial slaughterhouses, poultry slaughterhouses in particular, are a place I focus on in my book in order to supply Americans with the cheap beef, chicken, and pork that we eat, but from which the folks who consume this meat are conveniently shielded, never having to see the conditions for both the workers and the animals. And as I thought about these different forms of dirty work, 2 shared characteristics really stood out. The first is that this work is hidden. It's hidden behind walls and concrete barriers in the case of prisons. It's hidden behind secrecy laws in the case of drone strikes, so that the public actually doesn't get to see the footage or know much about these strikes as they're being carried out. It's hidden as well, and maybe most importantly, behind the blinders that we all put on to avoid having to think too much about what is being done in our name. And that hiddenness is crucial because it helps perpetuate this work, keep it going without too much public discussion. In fact, during the course of this book, there were 2 presidential elections. I went slow, and I was waiting for at least one question at one of the primaries about the ethics of drone warfare. Just one question. It never came, which tells you something about just how hidden this is. The second feature that all of the dirty work I look at shares is that it is unequally delegated. We don't see the privileged and the elites and the graduates of Harvard and Yale doing the kind of dirty work that I just described. Who do we see doing this work? We see undocumented immigrants. We see high school graduates in depressed rural areas where many of the jails and prisons during the prison boom were built. We see women and people of color. We see a lot of the same people who disproportionately did the essential jobs that were performed during the pandemic, and that for the workers involved meant risking their health and safety and suffering potential illness, possibly even death. The workers that I write about in dirty work suffer different kinds of injuries. Some of them do suffer physical injuries, in particular the poultry plant workers. You'll be hard-pressed to find anyone who's worked in a poultry plant who doesn't suffer from repetitive strain injury or shoulder problems or elbow problems or wrist problems, chronic pain. But the pain that those workers described that actually drove them to tears when I spoke to them was not physical. It was moral, psychological, emotional. It was a kind of scarring that the sociologist Richard Sennett has called, might have called, hidden injuries of class. In the case of the women who worked at this poultry plant, they were denied bathroom breaks because it's all about the speed on the lines. If you took a break, you slowed down the lines. And these Workers were mostly undocumented. They had a language barrier often. They did not know their rights, and they certainly were not in a position to assert their rights for fear not only of being fired, but potentially of being deported. And so some of them would go to the plant with an extra pair of pants or sanitary napkins and go to the bathroom while continuing to work. And as they described this years later, they broke down in tears. And those tears, like some of the other scars and injuries that the workers in my book experienced, are unquantifiable. We don't see them in economists' graphs and charts, but they are part of the story, I think, of inequality in this country, of a dimension of inequality, moral inequality, that mirrors and reinforces the more familiar economic kind. And I'll close with a quote from, just as Clint Smith mentioned Baldwin, my book begins with an epigraph from Baldwin. And in one of his less well-known books, No Name on the Street, he said, "The powerless must do their own dirty work. The powerful have it done for them." Thank you so much.